Joining us right now is former Army commander in Iraq and Afghanistan, Colonel Jay Voorhees. Colonel, good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, Maria, good to see you and the team.
Characterize what we're seeing right now. What do you think the message Iran is trying to send here?
Well, I think Iran is continuing to do what they've always done, and that's continue to push the limits of what they can get away with. They're like almost the bully in the schoolyard. And as long as they've gotten away with it, as well as gotten this nuclear deal, as well as continue to influence throughout the region, you see what they're doing in Syria, they're going to continue to do it. And it's very concerning as we move forward. Yeah, same thing with North Korea.
Exactly. I was just going to say North Korea as well. The U.S. military delivering more parts of a missile defense system to South Korea this morning. Obviously escalating tensions with Kim Jong-un's regime. And then you've got 100 senators, all of the senators today, attending a classified meeting at the White House this afternoon to discuss this growing threat from North Korea. Some of the president's top cabinet members will lead the meeting, including Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, Defense Secretary Jim Mattis. Listen to this. I'd like to get your expectation of this meeting today.
There are 4 briefers that are coming up to talk about the situation in North Korea. Obviously, the Secretary of State and others are going to talk about our posture and the activities that we're undergoing, and Chairman Dunford will lay out some of the military actions and the way that they see the lay of the land.
The President himself also expected to stop by today's briefing, sir. What do you think?
Well, I think what's important here and what you're seeing is the use of all of the elements of national power. We just can't use the military arm, and sometimes that gets so overblown. I think what you're seeing is an attempt at the diplomatic effort, which China is obviously the key to put the pressure on North Korea, as well as the informational campaign of how we're communicating our vision to all of our leaders in the nation, as well as our allies, that we are serious about the problem there, as well as the economic sanctions. That's going to be key. So I think this is a very, very positive thing that the Trump administration is pulling everybody in and leveling the playing field on what the threat is, because that's the most important thing.
Kevin Kelly joining the conversation, and we're happy you're here, Kevin. It just seems that foreign policy is where President Trump is getting the highest grades so far in these first 100 days. Your take?
Yeah, one of the most interesting aspects is that we're actually turning a lot of countries that we haven't worked well with in the past into allies. If you look at China, look at Russia. I mean, when we actually went over and bombed Syria, we actually contacted the Russians and said, hey, we know you have guys there. We're actually going to be bombing, and we're not going to tolerate these chemical weapons. Yeah, I mean, which is atrocious. And now you're starting to see China work with us as well. So that's pretty interesting, because before they've always had a hands-off approach. They're like, yeah, okay, American. That's why you had this saying, we've been leading from behind. So I think the policies that he's taking is action, and that's what we've needed in these hotbeds of areas.
Yeah, what do you think?
The Colonel can weigh in on this, but we've yet to see China step up. We hope China will step up on actually enforcing sanctions on North Korea. President Trump called on members of the UN Security Council earlier this week to heighten sanctions, to impose new sanctions. But we know that China has not enforced the ones that were already in place on North Korea. In fact, we found out last year that there were more than 600 payments from the Bank of China's Singapore branch on behalf of entities in North Korea. So they've been violating those sanctions. They need to step up and enforce the ones in place and back new ones out of the Security Council.
What do you say, Colonel?
Yeah, I think Dagan's spot on. I mean, talk's cheap. And, you can do a couple of pinpricks, which you've heard lately about, fuel embargoes and turning back a coal shipment. But the last thing that we need collectively is North Korea to be nuclear armed. And the key is China. She's exactly right. We've got to put the pressure for real results, not just kind of appeasement and making us feel good. And I think we're on the road, as even Kevin mentioned, to that. We've got to seriously put the pressure on China. They're the key, and I agree totally.
Kirsten.
Colonel Kirsten Haglund here. I'm wondering what your insight might be on what a good end game is, or a long-term strategy for this, because as you mentioned, China, with the maybe end game being reunification of the peninsula, we know that China is not going to want a free democratic state right on its northern border. So what should the administration's end game be here? What is he going to talk about with senators here and with his defense team on what that long-term strategy looks like?
Yeah. That is a great question. I think the long term is definitely a diplomatic solution like they talked about, but you're right. The buffer between South Korea and our influence up through North Korea and the Chinese influence is something they're very concerned about. I think the end game, again, is going to be very challenging, but it's got to be a collective effort focused on the key thing. North Korea cannot obtain nuclear weapons. So in order to make that happen, we've either got to demilitarize at some point, which the North Koreans aren't going to want to do. They've gotten away with this for years and years and years, and as that's happened, their nuclear program has grown. But it's got to be a denuclearized Korean peninsula up in the north, and that has got to involve China, and somehow some type of regime change, I think, would be ultimate. But it's going to be very challenging, Kristen.
You know, it's interesting because you want China to participate here and do something to show that it is, in fact, helping to rein in North Korea. But at the end of the day, and we discussed this last week on the program, what does China want, right? Does China want democracy in North Korea? Next door to it? No. Does China want, you know, refugees coming into China from North Korea? I mean, they probably want to push so far, but not far enough. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely, Maria. The last thing they want, even with this missile defense deployment, they're strongly against it because it continues to show our influence in the region. And the immigration piece is huge. If there's destabilization in North Korea, the immigration crisis that China faces is going to be huge. So honestly, you know, they are content in some ways with the way things are. But the reality of the situation is nobody within the region beyond China or the greater world knows that North Korea cannot get this capability. So it is going to be a diplomatic minefield in many ways. And I think with the influence of we're willing to do the military as a very last resort, and you've shown some efforts there, that combination as well as the economics, it's got to be a holistic national military strategy, as Kristen kind of mentioned, for the future that takes into account all the different efforts and brings in our allies. That's going to be the key as well.
All right. Great analysis. Colonel, thanks so much for weighing in. We appreciate it.
Great to see you guys.
Colonel Jay Voorhees joining us there. We'll take